Senhoras e senhores, como estão todas e todos? É um prazer recebê-los novamente aqui no canal da Equilibrium Consultoria, o seu think tank brasileiro. Hoje nós estamos com o Excelentíssimo Senhor Embaixador da Croácia no Brasil, o embaixador Ranko Vilović. Embaixador, muito obrigado por nos receber aqui na Embaixada hoje.
Obrigado para você.
Muito obrigado. Nosso diálogo hoje tem o título Croácia e Brasil, História, Amizade e os Desafios do Novo Mundo. Este diálogo ele é parte de uma série de diálogos que a Equilibrium tem feito, chamado Conversas com Diplomatas. Nosso objetivo é justamente, nesse mundo tão complicado que se apresenta, trazer um pouco de conjuntura e atualidade de uma maneira fácil e palatável com alguns dos protagonistas dessa cena internacional no Brasil. O diálogo de hoje, para aqueles que estão nos acompanhando, e também em deferência a nosso grande público externo, ele será um pouco diferente. Hoje nós vamos fazer o diálogo em inglês com algumas intervenções em português. So, from now on, presenting for you all, I am Professor Ricardo Lobato. I am the CEO and Chief Analyst of Equilibrium Consultoria. And this dialogue is entitled Croatia and Brazil, History, Friendship and the Challenges of the New World. Equilibrium Dialogues is a space where we let our guests speak more than we ask. They can speak freely. And before we start this dialogue, I want to read the biography of Mr. Ambassador, who is going to also have the opportunity of speaking a little bit more of himself. So, Ambassador Ranko Vilović is the official representative of Croatia in Brazil since December 2019. Born in Zagreb, Croatia, then part of former Yugoslavia, Ambassador Vilović studied law at the University of Zagreb from 1975 to 1980. After graduating, he started working as a lawyer, and from 1980 to 1985, he was a member of the Zagreb City Council. He completed courses in maritime law and international law in The Hague, 1982, and Halifax, 1989. From 1985 to 1987, he did postgraduate studies in international law and international relations in Zagreb. Ambassador Vilović started his diplomatic career at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Croatia in 1985. As head of the Department for Consular Affairs. He'll speak more about this today. Abroad has served in Bern, Zurich and Vienna from 1992 to 2002. From 2009 to 2013, Ambassador Vilović was the permanent representative of the Republic of Croatia to the United Nations in New York City. From September 2013 to August 2017, he was Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary in Berlin. His successor in this role, by the way, is Gordan Grilić Radman, the current Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia. The ambassador is married with 2 children, and in addition to Croatian, also speaks German, English, and French, with a working level in Italian, Spanish, and despite being very modest, speaks very good Portuguese, as you see today. So, before we start our questions, I always like to do this remark, talking a little bit more of Equilibrium. By the way, if you don't follow us, click on the link right in the bio. Get yourself inscripted also in our other media channels like Instagram and LinkedIn, so you have the best of foreign analysis in Brazil. But the message I would like to give to you all is the following. We're going to start, and I always like to remind that Equilibrium is a company that respects the plurality of thought. This is the essence of a think tank, and the political risk analysis that we developed is based on this working ethic. Precisely for this reason, Diálogos, or Equilibrium Dialogues, name as you wish, are a space for free speech where participants have the free right to express themselves, and their opinions are their own, not necessarily representing the views of the company. So, Mr. Ambassador, I begin by thanking you very much for agreeing to grant us this interview. And this is a part of our conversations with diplomats, as I said before, part of this big Diálogos EQUILIBRIUM. This very question is a request of yourself that you asked to be in Portuguese. So I will switch languages, just reminding you all that independently of the languages you're speaking, this video is subtitled, so there's no worries about that. So, a primeira pergunta, embaixador, essa mais para a audiência brasileira, um espaço que a gente traz. A biografia do senhor já foi apresentada. Mas sempre que nós podemos, nós gostamos que os nossos entrevistados se apresentem. Ter esse contato em primeira mão é sempre muito importante. Então, como a gente diz em português, isso tem um sabor especial. Ainda mais levando em conta que o senhor sendo representante oficial da Croácia no Brasil, as relações têm se intensificado nos últimos anos, mas a história pessoal do senhor também está muito relacionada à história recente do país. Então, por favor, embaixador, se o senhor puder, conte um pouco mais da história do senhor, por favor.
Primeiramente, agradeço uma outra vez para o convite. Fiquei muito feliz com esse convite, porque eu aprecio Diálogos EQUILIBRIUM muito.
Muito obrigado.
E agradeço por a introdução da minha biografia. Você disse que tem, na minha idade, outros detalhes, outras coisas que se podem contar ou acrescer. É verdade. Você disse também que minha história profissional fica um pouco ligada com a história do meu país. É verdade. Eu entrei em serviço diplomático em fevereiro de 1985. Como? Naquele tempo, a Croácia foi a parte de Iugoslávia, mas cada república, cada de 6 repúblicas, tinha seu próprio parlamento, governo e serviço exterior. Claro, a política externa foi formulada em federação, mas esse serviço, nomeado o Comitê Republicano por Relações Exteriores, tinha competências em cooperação regional e nas assuntos consulares. A Croácia tinha as relações com as partes de outros países, notamente com Baviera, parte de Alemanha, Baden-Württemberg, parte de Alemanha, ou Estíria, parte de Áustria, ou Friulia, parte de Itália, ou Ucrânia, então parte de União Soviética. E essas ligações foram formalizadas, não diplomáticos, mas em nível de trabalho. E eu trabalhava em departamento consular. Após 1990, quando a Croácia mudou o sistema político, após as primeiras eleições multipartidárias, esse comitê republicano foi renomeado a ministério. O mesma gente, e continuamos. É claro que tínhamos a continuidade institucional. Ano depois, a Iugoslávia dissolveu, e a primeira coisa que tivemos a fazer foi trabalhar por reconhecimento internacional de soberania, de independência da Croácia, segundo fazer os contatos e uma rede de instituições diplomáticas e consulares no mundo. E isso fizemos com muita energia e com muito sucesso. Ano depois, fiquei colocado fora, no estrangeiro, Você já disse a Berna, primeiramente, Zurique, depois de volta, voltou em Croácia, em ministério, Viena, Nova York, Berlim, e agora estou aqui. O que é muito para destacar, quando fui em Nova York, isso foi a tempo quando a Croácia tinha o membro de Conselho de Segurança não permanente. Isso foi uma experiência extraordinária. Eu tinha o privilégio de presidir comitê de Security Council, comitê muito importante contra terrorismo.
CTC.
E depois, após 2, 3 anos, presidi também outro órgão importante, Peace Building Commission, a Comissão por a Paz.
Manutenção da paz. Ou seja, a gente pode dizer que a segunda metade do século, o final da segunda metade do século XX, os primeiros anos movimentados do século XXI, o senhor participou ativamente desse processo.
Sim.
Back to English. Thank you very much. Well, to our Brazilian audience, you have seen as good as Mr. Ambassador can, speak a very good Portuguese.
Thank you for tolerating my poor brother.
Now that our audience knows a little bit more about you, let us talk about Croatia and the country's relationship with Brazil. Croatia is an ancient country. We can trace it back to the 900s. But in its current form, the Republic of Croatia has existed since 1991, 1992, which you've already spoken. We are speaking of a little bit more than 30 years, a generation. Brazilians know little about Croatia. Perhaps the country's greatest memory is in the World Cup, including an episode in the last championship in Qatar. And the most famous Croatian in our times is exactly a soccer player, Luka Modric. However, Croatia is much more than that, and more than just beautiful beaches, because the other memory that many Brazilians have discovered in the last years are exactly the beautiful coast of the Adriatic. In foreign relations, Brazil and Croatia are great partners, mutually supporting each other in matters of multilateral agenda. That said, can you talk a little bit more about Croatia and the relationship with Brazil?
Sure. Thank you for your first sentence that Croatia is an old country, but relatively recently gained independence. Our statehood stems from 8th century, when we had a recognition then by the Pope, which is equivalent to the international recognition nowadays.
Okay.
As of 925, we had our own kings, and so on and so forth. So it was an international factor at that time, if we can speak in these terms in Middle Ages. As of 1102, we were always part of some bigger association, be it Croatian-Hungarian Kingdom, be it later on Austria, be it Austro-Hungarian monarchy, or the Venetian Republic, or First Yugoslavia or Second Yugoslavia. So we were always there, but never as the independent country, as the independent state. And our independence occurred, as you said, in 1991, after the dissolution of all the previous states and associations. So one would think that our relations with Brazil begin then. Brazil was one of the first countries that recognized independence of Croatia. It was in spring 1992 already. but relations between our countries are much older. I think that we had the first wave of emigrants, economic emigrants, towards the end of the 19th century. So it's some 130, 140 years ago. Then it was followed by the waves of economic emigration, particularly in the 20th years of the 20th century. That's how the people started knowing each other and knowing about each other. We had examples with some priests even in the 17th and 18th century here in Brazil who worked on the field of astronomy.
Okay.
But it was not a rule. The rule started at the end of 19th century. Now, let me focus on the relations after the independence, after 1991. The relations between Brazil and Croatia are very good, no open issues, very friendly. We are physically distant, so it impedes the more frequent visit of officials. But let me just mention the latest one. The foreign minister, Mauro Vieira, visited Croatia. Before being appointed as a foreign minister, he was the ambassador of Brazil to Croatia, to Zagreb, and we are very much happy and proud on that fact. So one of his first visits was Croatia, which witnesses to the strength and quality of the relations. Now we also developed a lot of relations in multilateral fora or other international organizations, being mostly or always on the same side, supporting each other, be it candidatures, be it ideas, initiatives, whatever. Of course, we always then have to say our economic cooperation lags behind.
If I may,
sure.
This is one of the points that we, that work with political risk, many times are asked. Relations between our account by foreign dignitaries, the relations between our countries, they are excellent, but it could perform better in economics.
That is true. The reason is, first, Croatia is far away. Whatever you export or import, it's 10,000 kilometers at least. It costs. Secondly, Croatia is not enough known in Brazil. Croatia is the size, it can be compared in size and in number of inhabitants with Paraíba. And Paraíba is not exactly the biggest Brazilian state. So it's 56,000 square kilometers, 3.8 million people. It's nothing compared to Brazil. I used to say to students here in Brazil, imagine that you have a theater with 51 seats. And 50 seats are Brazilians and only one seat is a Croatian sitting there. That's the ratio, 50 to 1. So we are small, we are far away. People here don't know much about what we offer. And what we offer are very good quality products, because when you are small, you must develop excellence.
High technology as well.
High technology. Our biggest export products are electrical machines, and then the products in the chemistry and the pharmaceutical industry. And that's all high technology products.
That compete, for instance, for people who are watching us, with German products, American products, British products on the same level of quality.
On the same level, and ours are sometimes even cheaper. There are a lot of possibilities, particularly in the last years, in the trade in military equipment, which is also very, very good, very high quality. But we hope that when this association agreement between European Union and Mercosur enters into force, and we hope that we will have progress very soon, that then the trade will be much simpler and easier, even for our agricultural products. Let me just mention our excellent wines that are here not known almost at all, because it's very difficult to import them, or olive oils. So products that really can find market here. So these are economic relations, but there's another point, human relations. If I remember well, Sérgio Buarque defined a typical Brazilian as homem cordial.
Homem cordial, yes. Raízes do Brasil, roots of Brazil.
Which is, we all whoever lived here, we just witnessed that. But I may tell you that with Croats it's more or less the same. Very similar mentality, very open people, very friendly, and not only tourists that come from Brazil to Croatia can witness it, but business people, everybody, I think that we are on the same or similar wavelength.
Very good. Very good. And it's interesting when you say this because Brazil, we have a branch in Equilibrium dedicated to education. And I always like to say to students that we are big, but we do not know many times our neighbors. This is starting to change with a great integration of South America. But even when we look to so-called West or some other countries, that we forget that there are countries like Croatia that we can have excellent relations. Yeah. There are enormous possibilities of working together. Just need to focus on that.
Exactly. For example, both Brazil and Croatia have a lot of startups, particularly in the IT technology. They are in both countries on the top level. This is one of the possibilities. We have several smart cities, European recognized smart cities, with all the necessary technologies and application of ideas. We can further work on that as well. And that's what is not known, that Croatia does have something like that, and Croatia does not know that Brazil can absorb that. So our task is to put these two elements together.
We'll do this.
So when I said, if you are a small country, you must develop your excellence. Let me just give you some examples of what Croatia contributed on the field of inventions. We all know about Nikola Tesla, who is born in Croatia, schooled in Croatia, and made a wonderful genius career, mostly in the United States. And all his inventions we use daily. But people and your students and people in Brazil probably don't know that the guy who invented the parachute was Faust Vrančić, a Croat.
Right.
The guy who invented torpedo was Ivan Vučić, a Croat as well. That the guy who invented dactyloscopy, fingerprints, Ivan Vučetić, not only that he was a Croat, but he made this patent in Argentina. But the first police to use it regularly and officially was not the Argentinian police, but the Brazilian police, first in the world.
Madre Teresa was also Croatian, wasn't she?
No, she was of the Albanian origin from Macedonia.
But her last passport stated as a Croatian national, wasn't it? There was a story.
Maybe, but the main origin was like that. Okay. And there are several other examples. I didn't mention gravata.
Yes, these are very important.
But that is not the scientific invention, but a stylistic.
But a very important one that more than 600 years later, if I'm not mistaken, still there.
Still there.
Day by day. The next question, it's more geopolitics, which spoke, of course, trade is related to geopolitics. Let's back a bit in history. And as a think tank, Equilibrium is always asked about Russia and Ukraine. This is also on today's agenda. But before, the increasing importance of Croatia in the European Union. You've mentioned the agreement, but I wanted to look a bit to history. Let's make it the context of it, because it's always important to put history when talking about the present time and what we intend to the future. Croatia expressed its interest in joining the EU for the first time in 2003. In 2004, the European Commission made the official recommendation for this to happen. And on July the 1st, 2013, Croatia joined the European Union. So we do have a gap of 10 years between wanting and being accepted. More recently, it had full access to the free movement of the European Union, the Schengen area. And since January 1st of this year, 2023, it has had the euro as its national currency. What we have here are 20 years of process, practically 2/3 of the modern history of Croatia. Furthermore, it is unquestionable that the country has become an increasingly important player in the Balkanic region. From an European perspective, the country is a gateway to Asia. And from the Asian perspective, access to the Adriatic and markets in Central and Eastern Europe are a geographic facilitator exactly for trade. New old routes, and this is always discussed when talking about geopolitics, begin to reopen. We are speaking here of passages that had been closed with the fall of Constantinople to Mehmet II canyons in 1453 that are being rediscovered in the 21st century. Even more so in the context of the Chinese Belt and Road, but also on the Silk Road that has been announced by the European Union itself. Besides all that, European Union is seen today as no longer an innovative bloc as once was. The great moves of the giants of the past, Adenauer, de Gaulle, Robert Schuman, Kohl, are no longer seen. Some critics would say that the bloc has stopped being innovative, having the euro as its last innovation, and has become more reactive. Therefore, Mr. Ambassador, is Croatia the new blood that the European Union needs?
Croatia, as every country that joins, is always a new blood. But we'll come to that later. Let me turn back to the introduction you made to this question. Yes, we expressed formally, we applied for the membership in 2003, and we had the longest period of negotiation and preparation process. It took us 10 years, longer than anybody before, because the process was much more strict, much more thorough, and when we passed all the requirements, we were really ready to join. But even in the first multi-party elections, which I mentioned before in 1990, each and every political party that competed had in its program joining the European integration.
Okay.
European communities at that time, the name Union came later. So the formal process started in 2003, but the real idea within the Croatian political scene and the population is 10, 13 or even more years older. Now, why is it so? I don't want to go too deep into the history, but you mentioned these historical roads.
That was a provocation, because I know the ambassador and I share the same good addiction to history. So the floor is yours.
Yes, your trick did do its job. Now, Croatia was always on the brink, on the border between West and East in the history, in the past. Be it during the post-Roman times, in the Middle Ages or later. So it was on the very border, but on the western side. So Croatia was always on the border between West and east, but it belonged to the western side. It was visible in the post-Roman times. Okay. It was visible later on when the schisma occurred in 1054 in the Christian church. Croats belonged to the Western, to the Catholicism, and the rest of the region to the Eastern, to the Orthodox.
Byzantium.
Through Byzantium. Then Croatia was never occupied by the Ottoman Empire. It was always part of some other Austrian or Venetian, but never part of Ottoman empires. And these elements, plus one very important cultural element. When you visit Croatia, you will see the traces of two cultural periods that were important for the whole Europe and for the whole world, and that is the Renaissance and the Barocco.
Okay.
We were in the theater of that. It occurred on our territory, and it created parts of our identity. So you will find the whole cities in Croatia, like Trogir, that is a Renaissance city, or up north Varaždin, that is a Barocco city, preserved, wonderful for tourists. But that created us, enabled us to belong where we belong. So our normal reaction after gaining independence is, yes, we belong to the European Union, because European Union is not only the economic association.
Cultural.
It is the association of common values. And that's where we think we traditionally, historically do belong. Democracy, human rights, rule of law, three key elements, but in the last several years, more and more green economy, green transition, to name just several. So when we joined it, we, of course, as you said, brought some new blood, but that was a limited quantity of blood due to our size. But every new country brings something new. Now we don't think that we will ever be the most important country, but we have our place within the European Union. We do have our values, we do have something to contribute, and we get from other member states their influence as well, which is much bigger, of course.
Yes.
But let me tell you that Croatia currently is one of only 15 members in the world that is at the same time member of the European Union, NATO, Schengen zone, Eurozone. It's only 15 countries in the world. And we are in the process of negotiation with the OECD, just like Brazil is.
Just like Brazil, not automatic.
And we hope that within a few years we will both be there as well.
Good.
So this is really this elite club of the countries.
Small but powerful.
Noble. Now, what we get from the European Union and what we contribute to the European Union, it is always in balance. So that's basically the rough answer to your question: are we new blood, fresh blood? Now, geopolitically, there were always challenges in the history of European Union, and the history is less than 70 years old. And from every challenge and new situation, the Union came out stronger. So I'm convinced that even from nowadays situations, which is very specific, there will be a way out which will strengthen the key elements of the integration.
Thank you. And thank you for this ending, because our current situation leads to this very hard, that is exactly hard geopolitics, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We already have more than a year of the war, a fight that goes far beyond the theater of operations, and we also have another war, that's the war of narratives. Apart from the tragic humanitarian situation, we are talking about geopolitics, and being a think tank based on bringing to you political risk analysis, we always say there are no innocents in geopolitics. Regarding the situation of the conflict itself, both sides have lost a lot. But it is necessary to consider that despite all the sanctions that have harmed the Russian economy, but not as much as expected in the beginning of the conflict, the military movements are not in Russian soil, but in Ukraine, the country after a year is already devastated. For anyone familiar with Russian military history, their colossal losses, something that is happening while we speak, are a part of the process. To quote Winston Churchill, that's the way it is. That's the Russian style of fighting. Therefore, Mr. Ambassador, we would like to listen to your comment on two main points. The first of them, after this initial shock, did Europe realize that Ukraine was the end of the paradigm that there is no more conflict in European soil after World War II? And I'd like to do a parenthesis here. This is a paradigm that the former members of Yugoslavia never actually believed after the 1990s. The last war in Europe, as many Europeans say, ended in 1945, but for the Yugoslavian states, recent history. And the second one, is Ukraine, to our time, what Spain in the 1930s was to World War II, the prelude to a larger conflict, if you please?
Very complex and very, really hard geopolitics question. First, I'd like to mention something on the definition. You mentioned at the outset the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We prefer to use some other words. We see it, of course it is a conflict, but we see it as the aggression and invasion of Russia to the territory of sovereign and independent state of Ukraine.
And if I may, it is interesting to think that after a year of the conflict, the Russians still didn't name it as a war, yet as special military operation. Right. So these terminologies are interesting to be seen.
The terminology is always important. The narratives are important. But you can see also that in international documents, in UN General Assembly resolution, you have aggression. Yes. So we prefer to stick to that because that's what it really is. It is the breach of the international order, of the international law, and we define it like that, and all the positions and actions stem from that. Now, you mentioned humanitarian side. Every war has humanitarian side. That's always a tragedy for everybody. So you mentioned also the first war on European soil, which we know very well is unfortunately not the truth. We did have our war 32 years ago. Croatia was also a victim of aggression. We know how it feels. At that time, for those younger, we had arms embargo, so no military or other assistance from abroad. We had almost 1/3 of the territory occupied, and almost 1/4 of the population were displaced persons or refugees. Compare the figures. Yes. As if Brazil had 50 million of refugees. Brazil has refugees from Venezuela, and it's a big burden and it's a big problem. But imagine having 50 million.
That's a lot of people.
So, and we made it. We made it. So that aggression on Ukraine is not the first war, but at that time the world was busy with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the reunification of Germany, with the Desert Storm operation, with creating a new order in a way. So I'm not saying it went under the radar, but it was easily forgotten. Now, back to your question, what does it mean? Are we facing a new era? Yes, the security arrangements that we know in Europe, particularly in Europe, after World War II, that were arranged for 30 years and that had their formal peak in Helsinki Final Act 1975, it is obviously broken. What will it mean? One of the key elements of the Helsinki Final Act is no violation of borders, no change of the borders unless mutually agreed. And we see here the clear example of violation of that principle. It was violated in 2014 when Crimea was occupied. And the reaction was rather lukewarm. So we see this international order falling apart. What will replace it? We don't know now, but something will have to replace it. What will the world order look like then? We shall see, but I am sure that key elements of the arrangements we had before the aggression and intervention will have to be incorporated again. Sovereignty, territorial integrity of the states, no forceful change of the borders, and that's it.
It's interesting when you bring these because, of course, the conflict, the war, has been our radar since it started and even before. Months before, we were already talking about, we have had the course in our education department. And when you bring the Helsinki Agreement here, it's interesting because when we go back to those days, 1975, the Soviet Union, back then under Brezhnev, got out very pleased of this agreement because it has had a formal recognition of some of the borders that they pushed up on the final days of World War II. At the same time, it counted, and we have theoretics from both sides speaking so, including Vladimir Putin, to the end of the Soviet Union because it granted and underlined some freedoms of speech to the people.
Exactly.
So now this redefinition that being pushed up, that both sides need to sign, that borders are going to be replaced. And also, we have another element here is that you mentioned the word, a line, it's interesting, that the word back in the 1990s was busy with some other things. There was having the wars in the former Yugoslavia. We have Bosnian conflict that ended less than 20 years ago, so even a younger one. But another element that it's interesting on this is that despite all the movements that have been done in the Cold War, it ended without a big war. So, and like in history, these movements in human history, they always have a war as a mark before a great treaty. It was like this with Napoleonic Wars. So first start with the French Revolution movements, Napoleonic Wars, then Vienna, then...
Or even Westphalen.
Westphalen, back to 1648, yes. So the wars of Spanish succession that did a lot to us here. Then already back to the 20th century, World War I with a bad arrangement that was Versailles, and then World War II with Yalta and Potsdam. But then the Soviet Union crumbled with no agreements. So now we have a war. So,
yes, every war ends, and then we have a situation where we adapt. But it is important that we agree that if we support the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of states, and then you have the clear example of aggression and violation of those principles, then there's no place for neutrality.
It's interesting, yes. As a mediator, this is always a dilemma. Dilemma, for instance, that Switzerland is facing these days,
Yeah.
and the parliament voted this week against sending weapons, and this was a great debate inside the country.
Now, your notion about the comparison of this war with the Spanish Civil War, there can be some comparisons, but I think that the whole international setting is different. So I deeply hope it will not lead to escalation, to involvement of other countries, and that we will not speak about this war as we speak now
of
the Spanish Civil War.
For moving now, going from soft power to hard geopolitics, now let's speak a little bit of something lighter, also for the sake of our audience. As I told before, and in several of our meetings, we have also mentioned here a department dedicated to education and research, with each various courses at the most diverse levels and for various audiences. In fact, at the end of this month, we are going to have one called World Opera, Geopolitics in 3 Acts. The informations are going to be in the link below, in the description of this video. For those who are watching us, it's also going to be interesting if you are interested in geopolitics. And in many of these geopolitics courses, we are always asked, especially by international relations students, about a team, and you mentioned your participation as chairman of the United Nations Security Council. People ask us about Brazil in the Security Council. An old topic that now, with a new government, is back being debated. Since we have the pleasure of having you here, sir, I will raise this matter in our dialogue. But let me outline the question further, because I'm going to talk a bit of the relation between our two countries, also spoken, but the direct relations. I've also mentioned the current Chancellor, Mauro Vieira. He was ambassador in Brazil, was ambassador in Croatia until December, made a point that Zagreb be one of his first visits as foreign minister, and exactly this bond between our two nations. Brazil finds itself in a new phase. Quoting the government's motto, Union and Reconstruction, the new government is not only working in rebuilding domestic politics, but also in foreign relations. Brazil is resuming its contact with the world. We spoke of how both countries have supported themselves in the bilateral agenda and also in multilateral agenda. But this aim that Brazil has to go to the Security Council, to a reformed Security Council. You just spoke on how the world has got multilateral, how there are new focuses of power and how the agenda is a different one. It is no longer the Cold War, nor Cold War 2.0. The world is once again of the multiple poles of power. So, debating about the Security Council in 2023 is an interesting issue, and I would like a comment on that. And how do you see these of reforming the Security Council with Brazil in it? And would these be the actual solution for our current problems, or do we need to think ahead, not just in Security Council matters or UN matters?
It is quite clear that the current structure of the United Nations is a structure that reflects the world that existed in 1944 or 1945. The world has changed radically since then, and the whole structure is obsolete. We all know that. Now, it is a mechanism that is existing. And in order to change it and to adapt it to the realistic situation, it takes legal actions. Now, we know that not only Croatia, but countries like Czech Republic, Slovenia, Baltic countries belong to the Eastern European group in the UN classification.
Yes.
And Turkey and some other belong to the Western group. So it was a political compromise that happened 70.
It's a NATO vision back of the 1950s, actually. So
Exactly. Now, there was initiative that started some almost 20 years ago about the reform of the Security Council. And at that time, one group of 4 countries was created, informal group, where Brazil was included, the G4 group, that had some ideas how to change the Security Council, not only in the size, but also in the methodology of work and so on. And Croatia was one of the first countries to support that group for several reasons, because it reflected our position. It would ensure for Brazil the seat as a permanent member to the Security Council. But we think that in the meantime, Brazil has proven to be not only the very big country, the very important country, but a very stable democratic country. So we had no problem in supporting that. The problem is that, of course, it didn't get the overall support of all or the majority of the member states. But the bigger problem is, whatever you want to do in order to change the Security Council, you have to change the Charter of the United Nations.
something very complicated.
And in order to change the Charter, it must be approved by P5, by all 5 permanent members of the Security Council. You think it's realistic?
No, who makes the rules don't want to change them.
Right. So I think we should focus more on envisaging what world organization do we need. We have United Nations. United Nations made big progress and big achievements in the fields, in some fields like education, like health, like cultural heritage protection. In many aspects, it really made big achievements. But in the field of security, not always.
Yes, we have now our own rank, just to bring in newer data. We have more conflicts in 2023. People, of course, think about Ukraine, but we do have at the current moment more conflicts in the world than we have in the late 19th century. That was known to be a very violent century.
So the legal architecture will always be the consequence of what the big players agree. And now we see no agreement. And the formal part will follow after that. Until that happens, we will have the structure as we have, with all the advantages and deficiencies.
Complicated situation. Yes, very complicated.
Yeah.
Our time, unfortunately, is ending. I would just like to get this gap and to make you another question that always comes. This is very brief. It's about the crew, also from our students, since we have the pleasure of talking to you here, if you can explain to our audience. It's about the situation, the former borders that are still being defined, the former Yugoslavian states, especially between Croatia and Bosnia. If you could speak a little bit more about that, please.
Well, you mean specifically Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, or
in the general that there are still borders that mentioned that former Yugoslavia was dissolved in 1990, 1991, but there's still borders being redefined. So just a very brief.
We all know how Yugoslavia dissoluted, and that the consequence was the war imposed by Milosevic regime. First a little bit to Slovenia, then to Croatia, then to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and ended up in Kosovo. The issue of the borders was clearly resolved by the verdict of the Badinter Commission, and Badinter was the president of the Constitutional Court, French, with 5 members, saying that the verdict says that the borders of the former republics are being recognized as the new state borders. Now, that's the rule, that's a principle, that's very important for each and every country that appeared out of dissolution process of former Yugoslavia. But the fact is that the very line was sometimes not always demarked. It was.
We have had this problem here in Brazil, and people still don't know. But and there is in Instituto Rio Branco, they always say, and I remind you here that many people say that exactly the Baron of Rio Branco ended up our border disputes in the early 20th century, but we still have border disputes with Uruguay. Yes. So.
Of course, it is the consequence of the history where, take an example of Croatia and Slovenia, that lived in the same states for centuries, for 400 or 500 years. We never had border. It was either part of this monarchy or that republic, so we never knew exactly where the border is. And sometimes you have a border line which is not equal to the cadastral line, to the land maps line. So it's very, very hard to measure precisely whether it goes 100 meters here or 200 meters there. Sometimes a person lives on one side of the border and has a land on the other side of the border, which is complicated. But historically, nobody ever knew where the border is, and it worked for centuries. Now, the issue is, do you want to make problems out of it? Do you want to make a big politics out of it? Or you want to sort it out in a practical manner?
Yeah, this is one of the benefits, and exactly, the EU brings one of these benefits. We can bring to our dialogue today the situation that happened last year in Holland, where a farmer moved a stone 200 meters in what was his land, and he just changed the border of Holland.
Yes. A key element is if you want to build good neighborly relations, and we do want, of course, then everything will be resolved easily. The problem is with Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is completely different. It is not a territorial problem. It's the problem of the structure of the state. Because you have 3 key ethnic elements there, plus others. You have the Bosniak population, you have the Croatian population, you have the Serbian population. And they are not national minorities. They are constitutive peoples there. How to put it all in balance, how to put it in order. And Croatia and Serbia have a responsibility signed in the Paris-Dayton Peace Accord, a special responsibility for the parts of their population living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, very complicated situation. I will not elaborate it here because we don't have time and this is not the opportunity. But the issue is not the border issue, 100 meters stone here or stone there. We can resolve it. But the functioning of the population, the functioning of the states, within the structure that is extremely fragile and complicated.
I think it's a perfect ending to our dialogue today, before passing again the words to Mr. Ambassador, is to see that we are in 2023, 21st century, it's not more the beginning, it's developing itself, and we still have I won't say ghosts of the past, but there's still old disputes that still need to be resolved, and we have a lot of work to do. And good that we can enjoy the experience of those who are already working for us out there. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
The last point is exactly, we always leave this space in Diálogos. It's not a question itself, but feel free to speak English, Portuguese, how do you prefer. We always like our guests to leave the final message to the audience. This is with you, sir.
There can be a lot of messages, but just a brief one. When you decide to become a diplomat, when you manage to be a diplomat, it's a life that offers a lot of opportunities. And of course, you always represent your country, you protect the interests of your country, and you carry out the instructions of your government. But on the other hand, you have the wonderful opportunity to meet the people and the countries you would never have the opportunity to meet. You have the vision that is much, much broader and deeper. And whoever decides to go there, make use of it. At the end of the day, you will see that there are values in every corner of the world. That the only values that it is worth fighting for is tolerance, equality, and that excludes every intolerance, nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, whatever. Go for it. It's worth fighting for.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to see you here more. To all of you who are watching these, if you're watching us on YouTube or in any other of our medias, don't forget to subscribe. The link in the description is below. I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, very much for your audience. And we are going to have more opportunities of talking to Ambassador Vilović, not just in the Diálogos, but soon we'll bring some news. Thank you very much. Equilibrium, the facts and the whys.